Abigail has always felt the contrast between her simple life and the sparkling lights outside the bar where she works. She is a young girl with gentle eyes and a heart full of passion for music. Every day, after finishing her job serving wealthy customers at a fancy restaurant, Abigail rushes back to her family's small apartment in the quiet suburbs of Savannah. That is where she finds peace and endless inspiration from the old violin that her grandfather left behind. That night, the atmosphere in Garrett Whitman's restaurant is especially bustling than usual. Garrett, a rich and powerful man, always knows how to create lavish parties to affirm his status in Savannah's upper class. Gorgeous evening gowns and neat tuxedos appear like precious gems in the elegant space. However, behind that flashy appearance is a ruthless boss who does not hesitate to use his power to control and overwhelm those around him. Abigail was forced to attend this party not because she had a chance to show off her talent, but because Garrett wanted to use her as a tool to embarrass himself in front of the rich crowd. When she stepped onto the stage, the bright lights shone brightly. All eyes were on her. At first, it seemed like everyone was laughing and looking down on her. But when Abigail began to play, the soft and calm notes quickly took over the space. She played with her soul. Each gesture on the violin seemed to tell a separate story of pain, hope, and desire. The sound of the violin echoed in the large space of the grand ballroom, seemingly making the outside world temporarily stop. The voices of the busy streets still echoed, but in that moment only Abigail's music existed. One couldn't take their eyes off her. No one could help but be captivated by the sincerity and emotion she conveyed through each note. While she was immersed in her music, Garrett's eyes caught her. Instead of the surprise or fear he had before, he saw something else, a determination and inner strength that he had never thought of. The notes Abigail played were not just sounds, but also affirmations of herself, the voice of a girl who refused to give in to hardship and oppression. After the song ended, the atmosphere in the room was as quiet as ever. The silence stretched on, only the soft sighs of the party attendees. Garrett stood up, his eyes no longer cold as before. Instead, he saw a spark in Abigail's eyes, a spark of freedom and desire. "Abigail," Garrett said, his voice low and rarely showing emotion, "I didn't know you were capable of this. Perhaps I misjudged you." Abigail opened her eyes and met Garrett's gaze. She felt a surge of emotion but remained calm. "Thank you, Garrett. The violin is all I have, and it has always been my trusted companion." Garrett smiled, a genuine smile for the first time in years. "Maybe it's time for me to rethink how I treat others. Would you like to collaborate with me? I want to organize charity concerts, and I think your talent would be a special highlight." Abigail was surprised but also felt a glimmer of hope. "I'd love to collaborate, Garrett, but I need to make sure my music is respected and not exploited." Garrett nodded, his eyes showing sincerity. "I promise not to let you down. Let your music shine as it deserves." From that night on, Abigail's life changed in an unexpected way. Garrett, with his support, helped her organize small performances at charity events, where her music was not only admired but also inspired many people. She began to receive invitations from music producers and prestigious academies, opportunities that she had only dreamed of before. Gradually, Abigail became a widely known artist in the Savannah music community. However, she never forgot her roots and the hardship she had gone through. She still worked at the restaurant, not because she needed the money, but because she wanted to stay connected to her family and keep a little peace in the midst of her busy life. One day, while preparing for a big concert at the city's cultural center, Abigail received an unexpected call from Garrett. He announced that a major sponsor wanted to sponsor her international tour. It was an opportunity Abigail couldn't refuse, but it also raised many questions about her future and what she truly wanted. As she prepared for the performance, Abigail reflected on her journey. She remembered the long nights of practice, the sweat and tears she shed on her old violin. She knew that every step she took was the result of perseverance and belief in herself. She also realized that, although Garrett had helped her get the opportunity, in the end, it was up to her to decide which path she would take. The concert went smoothly, with hundreds of people attending from all over. When Abigail stepped onto the stage, The bright lights illuminated her, and her heart pounded in her chest. She began to play, and this time her music was not only a personal release, but also a message to everyone about the power of dreams and perseverance. When the song ended, the audience stood up and cheered. The applause was loud and continuous. Abigail felt a surge of happiness in her heart, knowing that she had overcome the challenges and affirmed herself. Garrett, standing in the crowd, looked at her with pride and admiration. "Congratulations, Abigail," Garrett approached her after the performance. "You have proven that music can truly change lives." Abigail smiled, knowing that her journey was still long, but she was ready to move forward with faith and passion. She understood that, no matter how many difficulties, as long as there was love for music and perseverance, any dream could come true. The next day, as the sun was just rising over Savannah, Abigail woke up with a hopeful mood. She knew that each passing day was a step closer to her dream. She was ready for new challenges with her violin on her shoulder and her heart full of passion. Her family, although still living in modesty, were proud of Abigail's achievements. Her mother, who used to work hard as a seamstress, now proudly watched her daughter become a successful artist. Her father, a carpenter, always encouraged her, "Always keep the faith and never give up on your dreams." Abigail is not only an artist, but also a symbol of resilience and self-belief. She has proven that, despite coming from a poor family, despite facing challenges and oppression with passion and effort, people can overcome all barriers to achieve success. In her next concert, Abigail decided to share her story with the audience. She talked about her difficult days, about the old violin that her grandfather left her, and about the support of Garrett Whitman that she never dared to expect. Her story is not only about music, but also about humanity, about help and gratitude. At the end of the performance, the audience stood up and cheered enthusiastically, not only because of the wonderful music, but also because of Abigail's inspirational story. She feels like she is not only an artist, but also an inspiration to those who are fighting for their dreams. Abigail knows that her journey is still long, but she is no longer afraid. With her violin on her shoulder and her heart full of passion, she is ready to move forward, bring her music to every corner of the world, and continue to inspire those who need it the most. She always felt out of place. As she moved through the crowd, Abigail bowed her head, balancing the tray of champagne glasses with a practiced precision. Laughter and lively conversation filled the air, mentioning villas in Dalat, luxury vacations in Paris, and successes on the stock market. All of which seemed far removed from her life, where the most exciting thing in a week might be finding a few extra bucks to replace her violin strings. Despite her efforts to blend into the background, Mr. Garrett Whitman's eyes finally caught her. He was in the middle of a lively discussion with a group of businessmen when his wandering gaze stopped, noticing the young woman passing by. There was something about her that caught Garrett's attention. Maybe it was the way she moved, so effortlessly, as if she were trying to disappear. Or maybe it was the tired look on her face, a tired look he had seen on countless others who worked hard but were not rewarded. Whatever the reason, Garrett felt a familiar pleasure. He loved moments like this to remind those under his command of their place, to remind them that in his world, they were simply there to serve. "Excuse me, can you help me?" he called, his voice rising above the bustle of conversation around him. Abigail's heart pounded, and she glanced up, meeting Garrett's eyes for a moment before quickly looking away. She was not allowed to make eye contact with guests, especially not with someone like Garrett Whitman. Her colleagues had warned her about him, about his temper, his arrogance, his cruel sense of humor. Careful not to spill a drop of wine on the tray, she moved toward him. As she got closer, Garrett flashed a smile that sent shivers down her spine. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice casual but somehow inexplicable. "Abigail," she replied softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "Abigail," he repeated, savoring the sound of her name as if it were a strange thing. "Tell me, Abigail, what do you do besides serve wine?" She hesitated, unsure where this was going. "I play the violin," she whispered, almost wishing she hadn't said it. Immediately, Garrett's smile widened. "The violin? Charming." He turned to the group of men around him, who chuckled at his feigned concern. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a musician among us," he announced, drawing the attention of those nearby. Abigail's stomach twisted. She could feel their eyes on her, full of judgment and mockery. She didn't know what Garrett wanted from her, but the bad feeling was spreading. Sensing her discomfort, Garrett leaned closer, his voice dropping to a more personal tone. "Why don't you show us, Abigail? There's a violin right there in the orchestra section. Why don't you play for us?" The room froze. Abigail's throat tightened, her palms clammy. She didn't want to do this, especially in front of this crowd. But she also knew that refusing Garrett wasn't an option. Everyone knew that saying no to Garrett Whitman was impossible. The silence that followed Garrett's challenge felt suffocating. Abigail could feel the attention of every eye in the room, waiting for her next move. Her heart pounded in her chest, her hands cold and clammy as she gripped the tray of champagne glasses. She had expected a quiet night, just doing her job, quietly fading into the background as usual. But now she was the center of attention, not by choice, but by Garrett Whitman's whim. She glanced at the orchestra, where a violin sat on a stand waiting for her. It wasn't hers, the one her grandfather had given her, the one she knew every string on, but it didn't matter. She didn't want to play, not here, not in front of people who would look at her with judgment, expecting her to fail. Shame was creeping up her neck, staining her cheeks. Garrett was still watching her closely, the same delighted smile on his lips. He wasn't asking, this was an order and there was no escape. "Go on, Abigail," he said, his voice soft but dark. "Show us what you've got." Laughter from the group around her made her skin tingle. She could hear the contempt in their voices, the subtle mockery they didn't try to hide. To them, this was just part of the evening's entertainment. Humiliating the staff was just another way to pass the time. Taking a shaky breath, Abigail set the tray of glasses down on a nearby table, wiping her damp hands on her robe. She walked toward the orchestra, her feet feeling heavy. The walk to the violin stand seemed to drag on forever. When she reached it, she picked it up carefully, her fingers lightly brushing the strings as she adjusted her grip. It felt foreign in her hands, not at all like her own. Her heart rate picked up as she stood before the crowd, the weight of their gazes pressing down on her. She could see the anticipation written on their faces. This poor girl, what does she think she can offer them? Garrett stood to one side, arms crossed, clearly enjoying the moment. Abigail closed her eyes for a moment, trying to focus. Her mind was racing, and for a moment she wanted to throw down the guitar and run. But she couldn't. If she ran now, it would be exactly what Garrett wanted, her complete humiliation. Her grandfather's words echoed in her head. "This guitar is your bridge, Abigail. It will take you where you need to go." Taking a deep breath, she steadied her shaking hands and lifted the pick to the strings. The room was quiet, the anticipation palpable. She could feel her heart pounding in her ears, but she couldn't focus on that right now. She had to focus on the music. She had to let it guide her. The first notes rang softly, almost hesitantly, through the air. It wasn't perfect, not right away. The grip was too tight, her fingers stiff with anxiety. But as the melody began to take shape, something inside her changed. The muscles relaxed, and the fingers moved more freely. She played the piece her grandfather had taught her, the piece that had always calmed her in her darkest moments. It was a sad piece, but also a hopeful one. It carried the weight of all her dreams, all her struggles. The laughter from the crowd had faded. The mocking whispers had stopped as the notes flowed from the violin, coming to life on their own, filling the space with a gentle, painful beauty. Abigail's eyes remained closed, and she let the music guide her, completely absorbed in the melody. In that moment, it was just her and the violin, everything else around her becoming meaningless. The room seemed to shrink, the crowd fading away as the music enveloped everyone. The tension in the air melted away, replaced by a softer, more profound feeling. The notes were like a gentle breeze that moved everyone in the room, even those who had initially laughed. Garrett, who had been smirking, suddenly had a change of expression. The smugness disappeared from his face, replaced by something else, something that surprised even him. The melody Abigail played stirred something deep inside him, an emotion he hadn't felt in years. It was a strange, almost unpleasant feeling, like a distant memory trying to resurface. The room remained completely silent as Abigail continued to play. Her heart and soul poured into each note. For her, this was more than a performance, it was a release, a way to express everything she couldn't put into words. She didn't care about the audience anymore. This was her moment, and she wasn't about to let it pass. As the last note died down into silence, Abigail lowered her violin, breathing heavily, her heart still pounding. She opened her eyes and looked out at the crowd, expecting to see the same judgment and scorn as before. But instead there was only silence. No laughter, no whispers, just silence. Then slowly the sound of applause began to fill the room. It started softly, as if the audience wasn't sure how to react, but quickly built up to a full-blown applause. Abigail stood silently, still holding her violin, her mind trying to process what was happening. She had braced herself for laughter, for ridicule, but this was something she had not expected. Applause rang out in the large room, and for a moment, Abigail felt as if she were flying. Her heart, which had been pounding with fear, now raced with disbelief. She looked around, her eyes catching the people she had served just minutes before, now standing up to applaud in genuine admiration. Some guests even wiped away tears at the sad beauty of the performance. Abigail could not remember the last time she had received praise like this, if ever. Her days had been filled with hard work, rejection letters, and the constant thought that perhaps her dream was too far-fetched. But here, in this lavish room filled with Savannah's wealthiest and most powerful people, they saw her not as just a waitress. For the first time, they saw her as an artist. Her fingers still gripped the violin as if afraid to let go, afraid that the moment would disappear if she moved too quickly. But then a voice cut through the applause, a familiar voice that sent a chill down her spine. "Bravo," Garrett Whitman said, clapping slowly and deliberately. His smug smile was gone, replaced by an unreadable expression and a sharp gaze. He moved closer to Abigail as the crowd slowly returned to normal. Abigail's heart raced, the applause still echoing but now feeling more distant as Garrett's presence grew larger. His eyes met hers, but the initial amusement was gone now, replaced by something serious and almost frightening in his expression. He spoke in a low voice meant for her alone, no longer teasing in his tone, leaving a strange sense of curiosity. "You have a hidden talent, Abigail," she swallowed, unsure how to respond. Part of her wanted to be proud, to bask in the recognition she craved, but Garrett's gaze was so sharp and different from a few minutes ago that she felt uneasy. Garrett turned back to the room, speaking with a polished ease. "It seems we've been treated to an impromptu performance from an anonymous artist." He continued, "Let's give her another round of applause." The crowd complied, clapping again with a mixture of admiration and lingering surprise. Abigail felt her cheeks warm as the applause enveloped her, but she kept her focus on Garrett. Something about the way he handled the situation didn't sit right with her. She wasn't sure if he was still teasing her, or if her music had truly taken him by surprise. Then a figure emerged through the crowd, an older man with silver hair and a presence that commanded attention without effort. He moved toward Abigail with purpose, his eyes never leaving hers. The applause had just begun to die down as he approached, smiling softly but his eyes filled with wonder. "You played beautifully," he said, his voice warm but authoritative, of someone accustomed to being heard. "I am Leonard Chastain, conductor of the New York Philharmonic." Abigail took a deep breath, her heart pounding. She had heard of Leonard Chastain, of course. He was a legend in the classical music world, someone who could make or break a career with a few words. She looked at him with wide eyes, unable to believe that he was standing before her. "I'm Abigail," she stammered, her excitement returning at his greatness. Chastain smiled. "I've heard many talented musicians in my time, but rarely have any played with the feeling and depth that you've just demonstrated. You have a gift, Abigail, a gift that shouldn't be confined to this room or hidden away in a restaurant." His words came crashing down on her, wondering if this was really happening. Was someone like Leonard Chastain really offering her the recognition she'd dreamed of for so long? "I'd like to invite you to try out for my orchestra," Chastain continued in a serious tone. "I think you could be something really special." Her head was spinning. This was a moment of fulfillment for her dreams, and standing here in a lavish ballroom surrounded by people who had once despised her, She could barely believe it was real. The weight of the invitation and what it meant for her future was pressing heavily on her chest. Behind her, Garrett stood silently, watching the exchange, his expression unreadable. His initial attempt at teasing had failed completely, and now she was being offered a chance at life by one of the most influential figures in the world of classical music. Tonight, Abigail felt something new stirring inside her, real hope that it could lead to something extraordinary. Leonard Chastan's words still echoed in the air, long after the applause had died down. Abigail stood still, unable to move, knowing that her life was about to change forever. Abigail's mind raced to keep up with everything that had just happened. She had auditioned for the New York Philharmonic. Was this real, or was she dreaming? It all seemed too unbelievable, too surreal to be happening to someone like her, a waitress who played the violin in her spare time. The room that had been bustling with chatter suddenly seemed to have stopped breathing. The guests exchanged strange looks. Whispers spread like wildfire through the crowd. Everyone had witnessed a moment that should have made Abigail feel embarrassed turn into an unexpected triumph. The girl who had been invisible was now the center of attention. Abigail's heart pounded as she looked into Leonard's eyes, trying to make sense of the opportunity he was offering. This was everything she had ever dreamed of, more than she had ever thought possible. But she couldn't shake the feeling of disbelief. Why would someone like him care about her? She had no formal training, no prestigious background. She was just a girl from Savannah with an old violin and a stubborn dream. I don't know what to say," Abigail began, her voice trembling. "You don't have to say anything right now," Leonard replied with a comforting smile. "Take your time to think about it. But I mean, like I said, Abigail, you have something special, something that can't be taught. I see potential in you that goes beyond technical skill. When you're ready, we'll schedule an audition." Her mouth was dry, and her hand that still held the violin was shaking slightly. How could she turn down this opportunity? Auditions for one of the most prestigious orchestras in the world didn't come around every day. But doubt crept into her mind. What if I'm not good enough? What if this is a mistake, and I'm not ready for this big leap? She swallowed, forcing herself to nod. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you so much." Leonard nodded in response, his eyes filled with encouragement. "We'll be in touch. And remember, don't let anyone tell you that you don't deserve this. You did." With that, he turned away, lost in the crowd of expensive suits and sparkling gowns. Abigail stood there, violin in hand, feeling everyone's eyes on her. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, along with a wave of emotions, excitement, fear, hope, and a sense of disbelief that made her dizzy. Carefully placing the violin on the stand, she let her fingers glide lightly over the strings. The violin didn't belong to her, but it had become a bridge to an opportunity she never expected, a chance to change her life forever. As she straightened, her gaze swept across the room and stopped at Garrett Whitman, standing a few feet away. His arms were crossed, his sharp features no longer smug. Instead, his eyes were filled with an unreadable expression. They stared at each other for a long moment, the tension palpable. Abigail didn't know what to expect, an apology perhaps, or a mockery. Instead, his lips curved into a small, forced smile. "It seems I underestimated you," he said, his voice low and controlled. Abigail blinked in surprise at his words. She hadn't expected him to admit it, not after the way he'd treated her earlier. Part of her wanted to be angry, to tell him how he'd tried to embarrass her in front of a crowd. But another part, the part that was still thrilled by the wonderful offer she'd just received, felt a strange sense of joy. "You didn't know I was this good," she said, her voice steadying as she regained her confidence. Garrett's smile faded slightly, but his eyes never left her. "Maybe I didn't," he admitted, a hint of regret in his voice. "But you proved me wrong." There was something in his eyes, respect, maybe. Abigail was uncertain and didn't want to delve into Garrett Whitman's mind. She had her own feelings to sort through, doubts to contend with. But before she could respond, another guest approached Garrett, drawing his attention away from her. With one last glance at her, he turned and disappeared into the crowd. The music from the orchestra continued, filling the space where before there had been only tense silence. Abigail took a deep breath, her mind racing as she tried to grasp the truth of what had just happened. She had come here tonight as a waitress, expecting to blend into the darkness of the event and serve the guests as usual. But now she was leaving with an offer that could change everything. She moved through the crowd with more confidence as she headed toward the exit, thoughts swirling in her head. Could she really do this? Was she ready? The doubts remained, but beneath them was a small but steady glimmer of hope. For the first time in a long time, the dream of becoming a violinist no longer felt far-fetched. It felt real, felt possible. Meanwhile, Garrett Whitman couldn't shake the feeling that had overwhelmed him since the performance Abigail's. He was never one to let emotions get to him. At least his own emotions were messy and complicated. And in his line of work, they were a burden. He had built his empire on cold decisions, not letting emotions cloud his judgment. But tonight, something had changed. The tune Abigail played had awakened something deep inside him, something he had long buried. As the night continued and the guests mingled, complimenting him on another successful event, Garrett found himself backing away, his mind aloof from the cheerful words being exchanged around him. His thoughts kept drifting to Abigail at the violin, her fingers moving over the strings with ease and passion. It had been a long time since music had affected him like this, and the tune was so familiar, bringing with it fragments of memories he had tried to forget. To elaborate, slowly fragments of memories of his childhood home, where his mother used to play the piano late into the night, began to surface. His mother, the only person in his life who truly understood him, had been the one who kept the music going in their family, the one who brought him a sense of magic through each note. But after the bloody accident that took his mother when he was a teenager, Garrett had frozen himself emotionally, lost in ambition and determination to prove he needed no one. But the music had died with his mother until tonight. Abigail's performance had reopened the gates of memory, the emotional fragments he had tried to keep locked away. The melody was the one his mother used to play. He hadn't realized it right away, but over the long night, it had slowly become clear. Garrett slowly moved toward the large window at the end of the room as his eyes scanned the dark Savannah skyline, the city lights twinkling in the distance. But his mind was elsewhere, on the memories of his mother and the music that had changed his life. He understood that this opportunity with Abigail was not only a turning point in his career, but also a chance for him to heal his own long-standing emotional wounds. Garrett stood by the window of his apartment, the city lights below casting long shadows against the walls. Abigail's melody played over and over in his mind, haunting him like a ghost of his past. How had she known that tune? It was more than a coincidence, it was a thread connecting him to a time he had buried long ago, a time when his mother's music filled their home with warmth and a sense of belonging. Now the same melody had returned, unbidden, bringing with it memories he had locked away. He turned away from the window, his jaw clenched tightly as he paced the room. The emotions surging within him felt foreign, almost intrusive. Vulnerability wasn't something Garrett allowed himself to feel, not after years of cultivating a life of control and precision. Yet, here he was, shaken by the simple act of a young woman playing a tune. It wasn't just the music, it was Abigail herself. Her serene focus as she played, her fingers gliding effortlessly over the strings, and the passion that radiated from her had all stirred something deep within him, something he couldn't ignore. The next morning, Garrett found himself unable to concentrate on his usual routine. Work emails sat unanswered and his coffee grew cold as he stared blankly at his laptop screen. He needed answers. The questions buzzing in his mind wouldn't let him rest. Who was Abigail? How had she learned that melody? Was it possible she had known his mother? He decided to take a walk, hoping the crisp morning air would clear his head. But instead, his steps led him to the music conservatory where Abigail worked part-time as a teaching assistant. He lingered outside the grand old building, the sound of violins and pianos spilling out through the open windows. For a moment he hesitated. What was he even doing here? This wasn't like him. Yet before he could convince himself to leave, the door swung open, and there she was. Abigail stepped out, her violin case slung over one shoulder, her eyes downcast as if lost in thought. She didn't notice him at first, and Garrett took a moment to study her. She seemed younger somehow, almost fragile, as if the weight of her newfound attention was too much to bear. When her eyes finally met his, they widened in surprise. "Mr. Whitman?" she said, her voice uncertain. "What are you doing here?" Garrett cleared his throat, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I was in the area," he lied. "I wanted to talk to you about the other night." Abigail's posture stiffened. "Is this about the performance? If I overstepped or—" "No," Garrett interrupted. "It's not that. It's the piece you played. That melody. Where did you learn it?" Her brows knit together in confusion. "I don't know. It's just something I've always known. My grandmother used to hum it when I was little. Why?" Garrett's heart skipped a beat. Could it be? The idea seemed absurd, but the possibility was undeniable. "Your grandmother," he said slowly. "Did she ever mention where she learned it?" Abigail shook her head. "Not that I can remember. She passed away when I was a child, so I never thought to ask." The weight of her words settled over Garrett like a heavy fog. His mother and Abigail's grandmother, was there a connection? He couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than mere coincidence. Abigail watched him carefully, sensing his unease. "Why does it matter?" she asked softly. "That melody, does it mean something to you?" For a moment Garrett considered brushing her off, but the sincerity in her gaze stopped him. "It was my mother's," he admitted. "She composed it years ago, but she never shared it with anyone outside our family." Abigail's eyes widened. "That's impossible. I've known it my whole life." Their shared confusion hung in the air between them, a silent acknowledgement of something they didn't yet understand. Garrett took a deep breath, his usual composure slipping. "There's something about you, Abigail," he said quietly. "Something that makes me feel like—" He trailed off, unable to put the feeling into words. "Like what?" she prompted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I've been chasing something my whole life, and now, for the first time, it's standing right in front of me." Abigail's cheeks flushed, and she looked away, unsure how to respond. The intensity of his words startled her, yet she couldn't deny the strange connection she felt to him as well. It was as if the music had unlocked a door between them, one neither of them had even known existed. Before either of them could say more, the sound of footsteps echoed from inside the conservatory. Abigail glanced over her shoulder, then back at Garrett. "I have to go," she said, her voice tinged with regret. "I'm late for a rehearsal." Garrett nodded, though every fiber of his being wanted to stop her from walking away. "Abigail," he called after her, his voice firm. "This isn't over. I need to know more." She paused at the door, her hand resting on the handle. "So do I," she admitted before disappearing inside. As Garrett walked away, his mind raced with questions. He knew he couldn't let this go. Abigail had stirred something in him that he hadn't felt in years, a sense of purpose, a need to uncover the truth. Whatever this connection was, it was bigger than both of them, and he wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. As everyone immersed themselves in tuning their instruments and chatting, Abigail felt a wave of unease rise up. She sat at the farthest end of the practice room, listening to the next woman. "I heard it in your playing. Of course you made some mistakes, but the way you expressed it meant something to you. That's not something that can be taught." Abigail watched the women quietly, each step increasing in time. She always played from the heart, from her love of the music and the memories it evoked. That's probably what brought her here, she thought. "Thank you," Abigail replied softly, a small smile on her lips. "I needed to hear that." The woman nodded, and the bird hummed softly before leaving into the night, the woman's heartfelt words still echoing in her mind, like a gentle, powerful melody. She had never thought her music could convey so much emotion. The night was still cold, but there was a strange warmth that crept into her time. "Maybe I really am," she whispered, her hand still reaching for the strap of her beloved violin case. Elsewhere in Savannah, Garrett sat quietly in his large room. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the dim light of the city stretched out, reflecting off the bookshelves and the rich mahogany table. He leaned his elbows on the armrests, his gaze thoughtful. These past few days, the mind of one person, Abigail. Not just her special performance, but the second music that marked a part of the emotions that gentle imagination had long since died. Garrett remembered the melody she played his mother's. It carried with it memories of his days as a boy, when life had not been equipped with calculation and coldness. He had been trying to experience the feelings of stress under the pile of work and obligations, but Abigail's music made everything explode again. This feeling created a moderate amount of chaos as she earned the walls he had built transparently over the years. The call from Leonard Chaston made things even more complicated. When Leonard asked for Abigail's support, Garrett found himself in a difficult position. He was not used to being trusted or reliant on. Garrett Whitman was famous for his ability to manipulate everything for his own benefit, not for goodwill. But Abigail was unlike anyone he had ever met. She did not have the support of abundant energy sources or extensive connections, but she had something that very few people possessed: pure passion and natural talent. Garrett understood that, without the right guidance, her ability would probably go to waste. After the call with Leonard, Garrett sat in silence. Part of him struggled to let it all go and get back to work. But another, deeper part knew that this wasn't just about Abigail. It was also a chance to confront himself, to confront his forgotten feelings. And maybe, for the first time in his life, he could do something that wasn't just for his own benefit. Garrett got up, left the office, and walked down the street. In the cold Savannah night, he decided he wouldn't let this go for nothing. He knew that if he wanted to help Abigail, he needed to approach her honestly. The next morning, as the first rays of sunlight crept through the windows, Garrett made his decision. He picked up the phone, called Leonard. "I'll help her." His voice was low and sure. Leonard had to be satisfied. "I know you won't let me down, Garrett. Abigail is worth it." Hang up. Garrett leaned back in his chair, a sense of relief spreading through him. He had chosen. And this time his choice was not just personal. It was the beginning of something special. On another street corner, Abigail still held her violin. She did not know that her fate had just been determined by a decision that Garrett, the quiet and complicated man, made. But in her eyes a quiet fire burned. Thankfully, she was also ready for what lay ahead. Garrett had the hardest time confronting Abigail. He knew he had put her through a terrible experience at his event, and if he wanted to help her, he needed to admit that he was wrong. Admitting mistakes was not easy for Garrett, but there was something about Abigail that made him realize that he owed her at least an apology. He quickly found out Abigail's address. Her apartment was small, and she exuded hard work and perseverance. As he parked and approached the door, Garrett felt a wave of unease. This was an aspect of life he had avoided for years, but now he was entering it. He knocked on the door, unsure of what to expect. When the door opened, Abigail stood there, her expression changing from surprise to something more incomprehensible. As soon as she saw him, she was standing in the doorway with her violin case beside her, clearly on her way out. "Garrett," she said, her voice neutral, though her eyes were flashing with confusion. "What are you doing here?" Garrett lowered his voice, trying to keep his composure. "I came to talk about what happened at the event and what's next." Abigail's brow furrowed, and for a moment she said nothing, just looked at him as if trying to determine if this was a scam. Finally, she stepped aside, inviting him in. Garrett walked in, admiring the small but cozy living room with its few personal items. A family photo on a shelf, sheet music scattered across an old coffee table. He could see that Abigail's life revolved around music. She sat on the edge of the sofa, looking tense, while Garrett stood there, unsure where to begin. He wasn't used to apologizing and showing humility, but he had to try. "I owe you an apology," Garrett began, his voice even but sincere. "What you did at the event was wrong. You embarrassed me, and that's not something you're proud of." Abigail's eyes flickered up to meet his, wide with surprise. She hadn't expected this. Garrett Whitman, the arrogant businessman who had mocked her in public, was now standing in her living room apologizing. "I've thought a lot about that night," he continued, "and now I realize that I was wrong. You're not just a waitress or a pushover, but a true talent. Your music is special." Abigail crossed her arms, her expression softening but still cold. "So you're here to make things right?" Garrett paused, considering his next words. Yes, and more than that. I believe you have the potential to do great things, and I want to help you achieve it." Abigail blinked, clearly surprised. She had expected more from Garrett, perhaps contempt or another round of ridicule, but she hadn't expected this help. "Why?" "Because you have something money can't buy," Garrett said, his voice low and determined. "Talent. I've spent my life building empires, but I've never seen anyone play like you did that night. You reminded me of something I lost long ago, and I don't want to see you miss out on it because of lack of support." Abigail looked at him, her courage beginning to grow. "You think I can succeed?" "I know you can," Garrett answered without hesitation, "and I want to help you do it." Abigail took a deep breath, her inner thoughts swirling between rejecting or accepting this opportunity. But the part of her that had always dreamed of becoming a violinist couldn't be ignored. "I'll accept your help, but that doesn't mean I trust you." Garrett nodded, a small smile on his face. "Fair enough. I'll prove it." The two stood at a new beginning, a relationship uncertain but based on a shared goal. Garrett had decided it was now their responsibility to move forward together. The lights from the concert hall shone on Abigail as she stood backstage, clutching her violin case. The soft hum of the audience began to settle in the vast space, and she felt the excitement spread. This was the moment she'd been working toward for weeks, her first solo performance with the orchestra. Her hands shook slightly as she adjusted the shoulder pads on her violin, but inside she was filled with excitement and determination. She had come a long way from that first night at Garrett's event, where she'd been humiliated only to turn things around with her surprise performance. Now, with the guidance of Leonard Chaston and unexpected support from Garrett, Abigail is on the verge of a life-changing turning point. This performance was not only a challenge but also an opportunity to decide her future in the prestigious Philharmonic Orchestra. The musicians in the orchestra were all experienced musicians, led by Professor Profal, who always demanded perfection from each member. Although Abigail had improved a lot, she still felt like an outsider. However, Leonard, the orchestra manager, had reminded her often that what mattered was not perfection but heart and passion, which Abigail had in abundance. As she stood at the center of the stage with the orchestra behind her, Abigail looked out at the crowd and saw Garrett sitting with Leonard and dozens of important figures in the music world. The pressure was heavy, but she did not let it overshadow the passion inside. The conductor raised his baton, the first notes of the orchestra rang out gently, setting the stage for Abigail's appearance. Her fingers trembled as she lifted the bow to the strings, but as soon as the first note left the violin, something inside her changed. The music flowed from the violin like water, each note filled with the passion and emotion that Abigail had kept inside for so long. The melody captivated the audience, drawing them into the world she created with her violin. The hours of practice, the late nights, the doubts and fears all disappeared as she lost herself in the music. Each note rose and fell in time, creating a perfect symphony. As the last note echoed through the hall and slowly faded, Abigail lowered her violin, her heart still pounding. The room fell silent for a moment, as if everyone was holding their breath. Then the applause rose strongly, becoming a warm applause. The sound filled the space, bringing a feeling of warmth and admiration. Abigail stood there, breathless but filled with joy. She had done it. She had gone before a crowd that demanded perfection and given them something better, something real, something full of heart. When she looked out at the crowd, her eyes met Garrett's at the back of the room, and he was clapping with the same quiet pride she had seen before. In that brief moment, Abigail knew that everything had changed, not just for her, but for them both. This was just the beginning. As the crowd began to clear out of the concert hall, Abigail found him standing near the door, watching her with his usual, unreadable expression. He had shown up when he promised, and now she needed to talk to him. There had been something about the way he had acted over the past few weeks that suggested a deeper connection, a shared past that she hadn't quite understood. She pushed past the remaining musicians and approached Ted, her heart pounding with anticipation. As Abigail approached Garrett, he adjusted his loose-fitting jacket, his hands slipping into his pockets. But there was a softness to his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "You're brilliant," he said softly, his voice sincere. Abigail felt her cheeks warm at the compliment, but she hadn't come here just to receive it. "Garrett, I need to ask you something," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil of emotion. "The piece I played at your event, it's been in my family for a long time. My grandfather taught it to me, but no one knew its origins. How did you recognize it?" Garrett's face changed, his calm expression betraying something deeper, something that had been buried for years. He bowed his head for a moment, as if searching for his thoughts before looking back at Abigail. "It wasn't just the melody that caught my attention that night," Garrett began, his voice lower, more serious, "but the way you played it. My mother wrote it." Abigail took a deep breath. "Your mother? How could that be?" But Garrett hesitated, his eyes distant as if pulled back by memories. "My mother was a talented musician. She wrote that piece years ago but never shared it with anyone outside of the family. She used to play it for me when I was a kid before she passed away. I hadn't heard it in years until you played it at that event." Abigail felt a chill run down her spine. The melody her grandfather had taught her had come from Garrett's mother. "How is that possible?" Garrett continued. "My grandfather wasn't just a musician. He was my mother's first love before she met my father. They were together before she met my father, but it wasn't just any love." The words shook Abigail. "Your mother, the one I've always known, wasn't my biological mother. You're my mother's daughter." The world shook as Abigail took a step back, her mind reeling from this new truth. "It can't be. I know it's hard to believe," she whispered. Garrett gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "My grandfather raised you as his own after my mother died, keeping your true identity and lineage a secret, so you wouldn't be drawn into my father's world of power and wealth, the world that destroyed my mother." Tears streamed down Abigail's cheeks as she realized her life had been built on a foundation she didn't know was a lie. Garrett moved closer, his eyes softening. "You're not alone, Abigail. We're family." Abigail's eyes were clouded with tears, but she felt a peace spread through her. The missing pieces of her life had finally found their place. She no longer felt like she was struggling alone. She had found her true family, and with Garrett they could move forward, honoring the memory of the mother they both shared. This was their new beginning.